So without any further ado, please welcome all the way from PagerDuty, Quintessence Angst.
Thank you so much for that, PJ. And today I will be talking to you about what I'm calling sensory-friendly monitoring, which is about alert fatigue. And since this is a talk about notification noise, as a friendly reminder, if you have Google Home, Amazon Echo, or any similar device, you might want to use your headphones or mute them. I won't be intentionally triggering these devices in the talk, but people will. People will. So, going into the talk, let's think about what happens when we try to know everything. It usually starts off somewhat innocently, but it gets out of control pretty fast. You can see from the lay of the land here, you start with some Slack notifications, you start integrating things, Trello and or Confluence of some kind. You get notifications if there's anything going down, status page, maybe HR or something pops in with lunch invites or whatever. And all of a sudden you have all this noise and it's making it basically impossible for you to be able to focus, right? You're dismissing things, you're seeing that Slack notification pop across the screen and you're like, oh, I read that, but I have to actually read it and address it later. Later probably never comes, right? Because Slack marked it red and you're not going to remember to get back to it because you're going to get to the next thing that grabs your attention. And to just really drive this home, when you have all that noise and you're making these decisions, all of that noise buries the important and high severity alerts in the sea of lower priority notifications. So if you think about the chat, hey, how are you, is burying down the notification for, hey, production is down in some region or whatever alert you have configured. So in order to compensate for that, individuals or teams might mute a notification source, right? You might mute Slack or close it or do something else so that whatever the mechanism is that's triggering all the time, you're not getting pinged over and over and over again so that you can focus. Or at least you hope you can focus, but it also means trying to notify people, they're not going to get notified, right? So you're trying to send those Slack notifications and no, but really this one's really important to this message or this email or whatever, but it's inundated. And as I try to manage that, I don't actually get any sense of calm. So I'm flipping back to me as the person who's muting the notification sources. So the other person who's trying to reach me now can't ping me on Slack or email because I've closed them or turned them off because of too many notifications from other disparate sources. When I cannot focus, though, what ends up happening is I get this, like my anxious Squidward up there. It's suspicious, right? It's not quiet because it's quiet because I made it quiet. And let's talk a little bit about how you can find a good middle ground between how you can make things quiet by making them responsibly quiet. And in order to set some context, let's talk a little bit about the cost of noise. So separating out from alerts for a moment, how many of you, as you think to yourselves, have lived with any other human being, family, roommates, spouses, anyone? And let's pick on the person that you've lived with that has an impassioned interest in something. It could be cars, it could be dogs, it could be gardening. And you may not personally have that interest, but you might find that somehow, somewhere, some way, you start actually being knowledgeable about that information. And you may not be cracking the books or listening to the podcasts, but you're osmotically picking it up from your environment, right? Because they're talking about it, they're listening to things about it, and it's in your environment. So if you think about it, if they're watching a special on whatever the streaming service provider is about, we'll say, dogs and AKC and whatever, and they're doing that over there, and you're over here working on your projects, your presentations, reports for managers, or whatever it is, right? You're still hearing that while you're trying to work, even if you think you're blocking it out. And this is causing your brain to kind of dual band and function in a somewhat distracted environment. So let's dig into a little bit of distracted environments. It takes an average of about 25-ish minutes to recover from a distraction. And someone actually came up with this number by doing a study. Her name was Gloria Mark, and she did a study at UC Irvine called The Cost of Interrupted Work. And in her study, she wasn't actually thinking about tasks that cause you to redirect your attention. So putting this in a more familiar context, this isn't the situation where you have a security incident and you drop everything and you need to address it. This is the type of interruption of like Joe developer walking by and saying, hey, what's the Wi-Fi password to your desk or your cube or whatever the situation is, and then walking away. A very brief interruption where you just tell them or pull it up, and then an interaction is over and you need to go back to, again, whatever you were working on, projects, presentations, etc. That brief moment of interruption cost you about 25 minutes, not in the interruption itself, but in your brain's ability to model what you're working on. And if you think of something like doing an infrastructure deploy or building out Kubernetes or anything like that, these very complicated tasks, you're building mental models, right? So if you stop and think, okay, whenever I've been interrupted, how long has it taken me to say, oh, I lost my place, and now I have to review what I just did and go back a couple of steps and redo the couple of steps, and you're trying to get your brain back into the state it was in when it was interrupted so you can proceed. There's also a quality cost associated with all of these things. So George Mason University, after being aware of landmark study, decided to do a kind of parallel study. And what they did is they scored AP test students. And for those unfamiliar, AP tests are for, I'll say, 16-ish-year-old students in the United States. And they are graded on a scale from 0 to 5. And what they found is when people were interrupted during their sections, their test scores dropped by half a point. So on a scale of 0 to 5, 5 to 4.5, 4.5 to 4. And what was interesting is that they then repeated the study, because based on Gloria's results, where they're like, oh, 25 minutes, they tried to add it back in and just give the students more time, give them that half an hour back roughly. But their score didn't actually improve. It still averaged out to be about half a point lower. This is another study for multitasking, kind of unrelated to the other two, but similar in purpose. So Michigan State did a study where 300 people performed a sequence-based task. Think less AP test that you're writing an essay or doing logic problems, and more Bart Simpson writing lines on the chalkboard. Same line over and over again. And so they said, okay, let's interrupt them doing this task and see what ends up happening. And they actually found it doubled people's error rate. So making mistakes from one line to the next, or whatever the situation was. So interrupting, you're not truly multitasking. You're not actually able to split brain the way you maybe feel you can. You're not necessarily able to completely return to the state you were in when the noise appeared. It's really hard to get back truly to that initial state. You might get back to a functional state, but it's a little bit different as you continue to move on. So when we shift this to IT, now we're thinking, okay, so the interruptions are less about, structured testing environments and more about when we were in offices, open office plans, but for better, for worse, when we're home, right? If we have cohabitants that are either, again, spouses or roommates or kids or whatever, this is a very high interrupt environment. What does that do to your process flow when you're trying to get things done for work? When you're trying to build out things or build out a new feature or fix a bug that appeared or handle a security incident even. All this is to say we need to reduce this noise, but how? So first step is to be aware and not overwhelmed. When we're talking about awareness, we're talking about, okay, I know that these interruptions are coming. Some of them are avoidable, some of them aren't. We'll get to that later. But right now you need to be aware. I'm probably going to be interrupted by my roommate. I'm probably going to be interrupted by my coworker or something, and just kind of let that happen and proceed. While you're proceeding, you want to make sure you're determining the sources of that noise. When we're talking about tooling noise, you might notice pretty consistently that your most common tool interrupts you. It might be a chat. We'll just keep picking on Slack, right? It might be something like Slack. It might be when we're going into, the stacks of things, it might be the service or something that is consistently hitting or going over under thresholds, which are then triggering alerts and so on. And as you're thinking through these thought trees, you're categorizing. So these are the things that I want, and this is where they come from. This is what type they are. And as you're doing that, you're going to channel that noise into some sort of productive flow. This is where things should go. This is how they should route. This is what's high priority. This is what's not. This is how we do. And just go through the process. And then you're going to do a routine to clean the clutter. And as a quick recap of all of that, while I talk more about the clearing the clutter, when you're talking about creating a routine, you need to make sure that you're doing it on the regular, right? You don't want to wait. Spring cleaning, we'll just use that. I use that as a metaphor, and I'll use it again later. With spring cleaning, you kind of have to wait through the winter months in order to get something done, but then it's gotten really overwhelming. So once you do the original clutter clearing, it's better to do it weekly or by sprints, right? In order to keep moving. Now, for those sources of noise, hopping a little bit back to the beginning, I mean, a very simple infrastructure can generate a lot of noise. I have a simple one on here where you have, Elastic as a stack, maybe your PagerDuty to send off the notifications in Slack and email, simple infrastructure, maybe in AWS or some other cloud provider, version control, and all these tools start connecting and linking to each other. They're all sending messages to each other. They're all sending messages to you. But next to that very simple architecture, you'll see I have a human just kind of hanging out. The reason the human is there is because you need to be aware of yourself as well. When you're generating all this noise and trying to work, how often do you check email, social media, text messages, Google Apple messages, and so forth? Literally, I have a delayed gratification extension in Chrome that delays, I think it's 5 seconds from Twitter or some other sites. It just doesn't open them right away because you so mindlessly just flip to a tab when you're between tasks or on your lunch break or whatever that you might not even realize how frequently you're doing it. And at least for the browser aspect of this, it can just be like, nope, you're not opening that unless you really want to. And kind of relevantly to us all working from home, the reason I put this slide in the beginning is sometimes you can accidentally trigger people's home devices. We were doing a presentation at the end of last year, I think it was. Time's weird, but someone gave the example of talking to their co-presenter whose name was Alexa and said her name and then said a statement that resulted in the listeners on any listening devices that were the extended audience of the audience queuing right in. And while it wasn't an intentional troll, it is a thing that can happen. Recommending headphones. Beyond that, you also need to set communication and boundaries, right? So let's say that you don't want to have a ton of Slack notifications while you're giving a presentation, she says, for no real reason whatsoever. If people don't know that you're giving a presentation or that you don't want them, pinging you unnecessarily, you need some way to tell them. But you also need to tell them what that focus time is. And you also need to keep in mind that you're talking to friends and family too. So more so at home, now that we're all here, if you have people that you're living with, if you need to focus or, oh, I'm presenting, so we can't share the office space for the next hour or whatever you need to work out with each other, right? You're setting boundaries, you're having communication. You also need to define what a relevant emergency is. So think about it like this. In an IT context, maybe the only emergency you care about during your focus time is a legitimate, outage or anything else that triggers a monitor. Or if a coworker needs to ask a question, say, hey, can you ask me in an hour? Or let the team channel know, hey, I'm getting notifications for this long. This is how you can reach me if something important comes up. But you need to kind of give guidance for what something important is, or else it might be important to them, might not be important to you. You might still get frustrated. While you're doing all of this, you'll want to make some reasonable expectations. And when we're talking about reasonable expectations, people aren't always able to keep track of your schedule. I don't know about you, I can barely keep track of my own schedule. So if you're, saying, oh, well, didn't I just tell you that I did this or that earlier in the day? They may have forgotten. Not everything we do is even on calendar. So for example, me presenting is going to be on a calendar, but maybe the focus time I spent writing the presentation won't appear on the calendar. So it just looks like empty space. So they think you're available in that empty space, but you haven't blocked it out because you're actually writing or doing something else with that time. They might not know that they can check your calendar. Your calendar might not be public or viewable to them in some way. So again, make sure that while you're setting boundaries, you're being reasonable, but what you can expect other people to actually remember and take action on. But getting back to kind of IT noise, right? I mentioned this a little bit before. Let's talk again. Categorization of noise. You have false positives, negatives. You have fragile flapping systems, and you have things that just frequently pop up over and over again. So when we're talking about like all these different types of things that maybe are noise that we just don't want to have, these are the types of things that you want to clear out beyond the ones that you want to keep, right? Because if you have something that's constantly triggering your monitor, but you know it's not important, it could be bearing something underneath it. So while its notification isn't important by itself, the fact that it's firing is. You need to save time when you create a noise flow, when you're trying to eliminate what's truly clutter and what maybe is being misrouted, right? Some of those, going back a slide, some of those false positive negatives, etc., they might still need to exist for some reason, but they just don't need to be routed to you. They route to somebody else. So when you're doing that, what needs to be known? Who needs to know it? How soon do they need to know it? And how should they be notified? So this is for the noise that you're keeping, not the stuff that you're trying to clean out. It's not uncommon, especially with redundancy and role division, to sometimes have things that misroute. I might get a notification that I actually need to go to the DBA group or something like that. The problem with this is I can't actually take action, let's say. I don't have permissions, I don't have knowledge, whatever it is. And since I can't take action on it, I now need to know who on that other team is either the on-call or the person responsible for this thing that I just got notified for. Instead, that notification should route directly to the team and to the correct person. Whenever you have a misrouting like this, you should always document it and make sure that you correct that. But you also need to be documenting, when I say how should they be notified, I mean how urgent, right? Some things require a page. Some things require a push notification. And some things can just go to an email or to some aggregate, like a Slack channel or something, where it's just pumping a lot of information, because maybe you need to look at it later or glance through it at the end of the day or the week or whatever, but you don't need to know second by second that it's happening. So as you're making those decisions, think about that. Think about how it should be notified, how loud that notification should be, and how quick you need the response, because you're going to be setting some agreements around the different notification pipelines. Even when you think about this in a non-IT context, many of us respond faster via text than we do maybe to chat like Slack, than we do maybe to email. And we know this, even though these are kind of unofficial boundaries between each other. And the same, in a more strict sense, is true of IT. If something's an outage, it should be very loud. If something that, hey, this is up, should be very quiet. It's also important when you're streamlining to make sure you have flexibility. So I'm going to pick on Slack a little bit because they're cool peeps, and why not? So we started at the beginning of the year with a non-trivial Slack outage that was really great in a way, because for all the noise that sometimes we get from just working with each other, we had no choice but to peace out. Basically Netflix and chill, but with work. However, if you have something like Slack as your only endpoint for certain types of notifications, those notifications are effectively now going into DevNull. They're not going anywhere. And if it's something that you need to keep for auditing reasons or for some other reason, you need to be able to switch that endpoint so it can go somewhere else, switch it to email or whatever it is, so that data is still being captured while that other service has an outage. Now, for a service that's mostly reliable, that has very infrequent outages, this isn't necessarily a problem. It's just something you're doing to protect yourself. But it's also important to make sure you're evaluating your tools, because if this tool becomes more and more unreliable, you don't want it to be a single source of failure for you. And all this goes into resilient noise builds trust, right? Going even back further, when I started talking about false positives and negatives, if things are firing off and making too much noise, there's not a lot of trust there, because you're getting attuned to noise doesn't mean anything. And this actually happened at Target. I think it was 2014. It was a few years ago when they had that massive security breach. And in their public-facing postmortem, in any event, they said their security notifications got buried in infrastructure. I think it was infrastructure notifications. It was just too chatty. And they couldn't see the important line items beneath all of the more info-level information. So there wasn't trust there until I assume they fixed it or whatever they did on their back end. And the same is true of other teams. You need to trust that the noise is loud enough when it should be. You need to trust that the silence is as quiet as it should be. And I mentioned this before, when you're thinking about this, always ask how reliable your tools and services are. and check how much duplication is needed, because you can't necessarily have everything completely redundant. You don't want to have no duplication either. It needs to make good strategic sense. This is very critical. This needs to be really robust. This is less so. This is less so, and down the line. Very directly, can you switch endpoints in the event of an outage? And do you need to for whatever that particular service or situation is? And are you regularly evaluating that reliability? Regularly evaluating, I recommend looking at it either every sprint, every month, or every quarter. Depends on all the situations that you have. You know what's best for you and your team and your org. But when you're talking about it, you want it to be something reliable, something relatively consistent, so that you can expect to have the conversation frequently. And this goes back to, don't do spring cleaning, because that's going to be a chore and you're going to spend time doing it. Do it when it's just picking up a shirt off the floor, just one. I'm going to keep with that metaphor though. When we're talking about how do you do just one, well, every time something fires, ask, was that notification needed? Was it resolved? Was the solution automated? Was it permanent? How urgent did it need to be resolved? And when you're going through these, this goes back to what I was mentioning earlier when I said, if you want something to be very urgently responded to, you need to make it very loud. And that should be the only loud thing. You don't want info level messages coming through, waking people up at 4 o'clock in the morning. You want user impacting, serious detriment, critical event, waking somebody up at 4 o'clock in the morning. That said, so some of the other points, if something's permanent or automated, you can either delete or pivot a monitor. So easy example, let's say you start off with a single web server. You have a bunch of monitors around that tiny mom and pop shop that just need a web store, something nice and small and simple. You're watching that web server. But let's say mom and pop gets celeb blasted on Oprah or something, right? And now they need more complicated infrastructure to scale better and whatever over time, because they're getting hit, celebrity hit of death. They might be doing something now with automation and scaling out and everything. So you don't need to alert on individual servers, or more likely if you're doing containerization, even things running those containers, you're alerting on the automation. You don't care if the container's down. You care if it's not resurrected and rebuilt somewhere. And so you're pivoting, you're keeping the purpose, but pivoting the design of that monitor. If a solution is permanently fixed, if you're triggering on a condition because maybe there was a decision made, like an executive level decision, where you kind of took on some technical debt to hit some deadline, but now you know that exists, so you create a monitor around it to kind of keep tabs until you legitimately could go back to fix it. Let's say you did. You can delete that monitor now, right? And then you can alert on whatever new situation you've created or whatever makes sense. If you're looking to talk a little more about this and learn a little more about this, I have resources on this talk's page on Noticed, and I will be available for questions if anyone has questions after the talk.